My name is Jerome Ferry. My cameraman is Alan Eggers. We're doing a video interview with Peter Bezanson, a Cedar Rapidian since 1939 and the past president and owner of the former Morris Plan and the More America Financial Corporation. Peter, tell us what year and where you were born.
I was born in Minneapolis, Minnesota in April 2nd, 1915.
Mm-hmm. What was your dad's name?
Henry Bezanson.
Mm-hmm. Your mother?
Harriet.
What was her maiden name?
Zwicker, Z-W-I-C-K-E-R.
Mm-hmm. Any brothers and sisters?
Yes, I had two brothers. Malcolm, the oldest, and Randall, the second one, and I was the third.
And you were the youngest then.
Yeah.
What was your dad's occupation in Minneapolis?
My father was a salesman for a huge wholesale grocery company out of Duluth, Minnesota.
Mm-hmm. And you remember your grandfather?
Yes, I met him once, but that was in Nova Scotia. That was when I was only about 10 years old.
Mm-hmm. What was his occupation in Nova Scotia?
He was an investor in ships that went out, fishing ships that would go out whaling, and also he was a cooper, which they made barrels for salt, for fishing,
seafood,
boats and stuff.
Mm-hmm. And your father ended up moving to the Midwest.
Yes, he came out. His older brother had come here in about 1875 or so, and then he started inviting his brothers to come out. See, my father came from a family of 12 children, and 3 of his older brothers came before my father. My father finally, in about 1912, decided to move to Minnesota, and he just got married and brought his young wife out to Minneapolis and settled.
He was a salesman?
Yes.
On the road type of salesman?
Yes, he started out with the Minneapolis Star-Tribune, a newspaper company up there, selling their subscriptions and advertising throughout Minnesota.
Mm-hmm. You were telling me that then the family ended up in Eau Claire, Wisconsin.
Yes, they went from Minneapolis to Glenwood, Minnesota, which is in the western part of Minnesota, and then he was transferred to Eau Claire, Wisconsin, and that was in about 1925, and we lived there ever since.
So you, as a young boy, 10 years old, and you grew
That's
up
right.
in Wisconsin.
That's right.
You were telling me you started being an entrepreneur very early in life. You sold magazines.
I started out selling magazines for Ladies' Home Journal back in that time, and then got a newspaper route in the afternoon, and then on the same area in Eau Claire, the morning route opened up, so I took them both. And here I was in high school by this time, and I was probably the best paid little entrepreneur in town. I made enough money to buy myself a Model T Ford in 1928, and the first car I bought cost me $10, and a 1915 Model T Ford.
What kind of shape was it in?
Well, not too bad, but I bought another one of the same year for $15, so I could have enough parts to keep the first one running, and I did.
Did you need a license to drive?
No, in those days you didn't need a license to drive, and you didn't need a ownership certificate. You didn't need much of anything except get behind the wheel and drive the darn thing.
I imagine you had quite a few friends when you
I did. But I needed that. See, the newspaper that I worked for was on the other side of the town, on the other side of the river. So I'd have to get up at 5 in the morning and go over there and get my papers and bring them back on the west side to deliver them. And I needed the car. That's why I had the Model T Ford.
Yeah. Did you, what high school did you go to in Wisconsin?
The Eau Claire High School.
And then was it your plans or your dad's plans for you to go on to college?
Oh, my dad just thought that I would be a tremendous engineer. And he could just visualize me building roads and railroads and bridges and all kinds of stuff. And I was pretty good at math, and so I went to the University of Wisconsin and started out in the engineering department. But after about 2 years, friends of mine who were graduating from engineering back in the middle 30s couldn't find a job when they got out. they were back home hauling ice and stuff like that. There wasn't any employment. So I thought, I'm not going to go through this and not have a job. So I switched over to business and finished up in business. Friends of mine, a few years later, as engineers, got work on the Pennsylvania Turnpike and the Alaskan Highway and stuff like that. But until then, they were broke.
What year did you graduate?
1937.
Yeah. So after graduation, what was your first real job?
My first job, I went with a company known as the National Pressure Cooker Company. They made these pressure cookers where you cook a whole entire meal in this cooker. And I demonstrated and sold those in department stores. Started out in Detroit, Michigan. Then went to Youngstown, Ohio, Pittsburgh. And by this time I was getting kind of tired of traveling and moving every Saturday to the new store somewhere else. And plus the fact I had a girlfriend back home in Eau Claire that I'd grown up with. We'd gone through school together. In fact, her name was Bing and mine was Bezanson, so I sat next to her and she helped me get through high school. And we were kind of thinking seriously about getting married, but I couldn't do that traveling the way I was doing. So I called back home and my dad told me about an insurance company in Wisconsin that was looking for young men. And so I got on the bus and headed home and got a job with the Employers Mutual Insurance Company of Wausau, Wisconsin. And started out in their training school in Wausau and then was transferred to Minneapolis as their branch underwriter and stayed there for about 4 years.
So,
or a couple of years.
So then, did you marry your girlfriend?
Yes, I sure did.
You said Lorraine?
Lorraine, yes.
What year did you get married?
1939.
And then it's about this time that you took a job in Cedar Rapids.
Well, it was a couple of years, shortly after that. I think we lived in Minneapolis about a year before I had an opportunity to come to Cedar Rapids as assistant head underwriter for the Iowa Mutual Insurance Company, later known as Iowa National Mutual Insurance Company. And I'll never forget when I first came to town to be interviewed. They put me up in the old Montrose Hotel. And I thought there was a train going under my bed every 5 minutes, but in those days there were about 28 trains a day going through Cedar Rapids, and Montrose was near the depot. And I tell you, you could just feel a train going under you all the time.
And you were telling me that early on, shortly after you come to Cedar Rapids, you started studying for a pilot's license.
Yes, I did. I had always enjoyed flying ever since World War I. Back when I was about 8 years old, the war had ended and a lot of the pilots were able to buy their plane, the old Havilland plane, water-cooled airplane, and open cockpits. And they bought their planes and started barnstorming all over the country at that time. They'd stop and fly in some farmer's field and take the farmer up for a ride to pay for the use of his field. And I happened to get acquainted that time. I happened to be near there on a hike one day. And the pilot came over and he said, you want to go up for a ride? I said, I'd love to. He said, well, you got to work for it. And so he put me to work checking people in, collecting the money from them, $5 or something like that to go for an hour's or half an hour's flight. And then they'd go over, he'd signal me, and they'd go over and get in the plane. And when the last one had gone, he called me over. He says, okay, it's your turn. So I got in this open cockpit plane and flew around the little town of Glenwood, Minnesota. It was interesting, and I was hooked on flying ever since.
In Cedar Rapids, what airport did you fly out of?
Well, I started out flying out of Hunter Airport, which is out no longer there, but it was out on C Avenue and Highway 30, and I've been there for years. It was a nice airport.
Did you, were you familiar with the Saxon Airport out by C Avenue and Blair's Ferry Road?
No, I wasn't.
Did you take your flight instructions in Minneapolis or Cedar Rapids?
No, Cedar Rapids.
In Cedar Rapids.
Oh,
Do you
yes.
remember who your instructor was?
Jim Watson was my major instructor, and he became head of the company when Dan Turner, who owned the airport at the time, passed away.
Did you ever belong to the Civil Air Patrol?
Yes, I was. In fact, I helped start the Civil Air Patrol in Cedar Rapids in about 1941, and became a major in the Civil Air Patrol. It was through that when my number came up in the draft for World War II, I went right into the Air Corps because I'd been in the Civil Air Patrol, and I lucked out and got in the Air Corps. I was too old to fly by then. I was almost 30 years old, and they didn't want me handling the planes when they had these young 19, 20-year-old kids that were much more
rambunctious,
than me. So they made a cryptographer out of me. Cryptographers where you code and decode messages. But by the time I got about halfway through the cryptography course, the wars both ended. And here I am sitting there drafted and with a family, a wife and a child back home. I wanted to get out. They said, oh no, you can't let you out. We're going to send you over to an occupation in Japan, Army of Occupation. I said, well, this is kind of silly. Well, no, because you're married and you've got a child, they'll send you right back. I said, wait a minute, there are 5 million guys over there that have been there for several years. They're going to come back before I do on those boats. See, they didn't fly them back in those days. They came by boat. The captain agreed with me, and he finally worked it out through Washington to get me a discharge. So I was discharged on January 1st, 1946.
And did you have any children yet?
Yes, I had one daughter at that time.
What was her name?
Judy.
What year was she born?
She was born in 1942.
And then, didn't you have a son, Randall?
Yeah, Randy was born
after you were discharged?
Yes, I got out January 1st, 1946, and he was born in November that year.
So what did Peter do when he got out of the service? What did you have in?
Well, I was in the insurance business at that time, strictly in the insurance, and selling insurance in Cedar Rapids. And then shortly thereafter, I set up my own insurance agency. And from there, I was a darn good producer, if I do say so myself.
When you got your feet on the ground at this insurance agency, did you get invited to join the Junior Chamber of Commerce?
Oh yes, yes. Friends of mine were the head of it at that time. Bill Corton and Russ
Knapp
and several others. They talked me into helping out, so I joined and asked if I could assist. So I assisted on several of the regattas that they had on the Cedar River, and on some other activities at the Hawkeye Downs. And within several years, I was president of the organization. So.
Did you get in on any project fundraisers?
Oh yes. In fact, after I had been out of the Army and still active in Junior Chamber, somebody burned down the chapel out at Cole College. And the Senior Chamber of Commerce decided to rebuild it or financially help. So they raised a lot of money towards rebuilding it, but they wanted to do a house-to-house canvass in Cedar Rapids. So they came to me and asked me if I would, if the Junior Chamber would conduct that canvass. Without hesitation, I said yes, because we needed projects at all times. So we did, and we did a pretty good job. And it was through that I got acquainted with some of the business leaders in the community. Herb Staymates is the one that asked me, but then through him I got acquainted with Howard Hall and Sud Cook and Mr. Dowes and Bob Armstrong, the leaders in the community.
You had mentioned S.E. Cocolet.
And S.E. Cocolet, yeah, he was one of those leaders.
What did they call?
They were the horse traders.
Yeah, but I mean, what was his name and nickname? The Coke?
Coke, yes.
Yeah. And you, I think you spoke of Howard Cherry and.
Oh yes, Howard Cherry. He was one of them, It was a group that met every day in the Roosevelt Hotel dining room, and they had a table in the back of the dining room with a big chunk of cheese in the center of the table. And they would meet and discuss various things in the community, all for the benefit of the community. And they were all helpful. Boy, when you didn't put out a campaign in Cedar Rapids for any kind of a building project without getting their vote of approval. And when you did, they picked up a lot of the tab.
They were the backbone, the movers and the shakers of Cedar Rapids.
They were a team, and they could obligate the other one in campaign financing.
And I suppose that they would look to Coquelette for financial assistance.
Well, yes, Coke was one of the leaders, but Howard Hall was the overall leader that I got best acquainted with.
Weren't you involved too with the fund drive for the old YMCA?
Yes, when they built their addition, I took Mr. Hall's name because I knew him, and I called him up and I said, well, I have your material on this. He'd bring it out and show it to me, so I took it out to his office, laid it out on the table. He looked at it, he says, we'll take a fourth of it. Now, it was $1 million campaign. In those days, that was a lot of money. And here he's committing for $250,000. I said, can you commit these other fellas for that? He said, you bet I can, because next week, Howard Cherry will probably have some deal going out to scout camp and commit me. So he said, we just do that. He said, that way you don't have to go see 4 or 5 people. We commit them.
This gave you a great chance to be recognized in the community as a young man, to get your feet on the ground.
And not only that, but it gave me an opportunity to meet the shakers in the community. They were the outstanding people. And I got to know them not on a selling basis, but on a community basis. And because of that, I got a lot and learned a lot on how to conduct myself when I was successful in business.
And then, didn't you eventually start your own insurance company?
Yeah, the Bezanson Insurance Agency. And it was through that I was, the first year, I'd learned in Minneapolis with the Employers Mutual of Wausau how to make a good living. If I could produce one policy, sell one policy every day. Now that doesn't mean I had to do it every day, but at least 365 for a year. If I could produce that many, I'd make a good living. So I decided to do it. And here I am with a wife and a child and a house with a big mortgage. And I broke off on my own on January 1st, 1949.
What insurance company were you representing at that time? The Hawkeye Security Insurance Company in Des Moines. And George Armstead was the head of that. He was quite an outstanding fellow. He'd run for governor of the state, but he was a great businessman. And I went over, and I'd met him. I went over and said, I wanted to start in business, and can I get some application stuff? Boy, he didn't hesitate a moment. And that first year, I was the highest producer in 1 year that the company ever had. Did you meet your goal?
Oh, I met my goal, and because I had to. As I said, I had a house with a mortgage and a wife and a child and a girl. So I needed the money. I worked hard at it, but I worked smart at it and was able to produce 365. And as a result, I made a darn good living right from scratch. And because that impressed General Armstead so much, he owned the Morris plant in Cedar Rapids, which is a little small company doing about $1 million worth of business a year. And he came over and he said, Pete, why don't you take over the Morris plan? You can manage that along with your insurance agency. You're capable of it. Well, he twisted my arm and we came up with a deal that I had formulated, and he accepted. And I became not only the owner of my insurance agency and producer, but also the manager of the Morris Plant Company in Cedar Rapids.
Where was it located?
It was down in the old ORC building on 1st Avenue and 1st Street.
What did ORC stand for?
Order of Railway Conductors.
Wasn't this kind of a...
it was a slum area.
Slum area.
It was a
time?
slum area.
Yeah.
All there were bars around the place, and it was not the best. In fact, if it was a dark evening, my employees wouldn't come to work. The girls just were scared to death, be down around all those taverns and stuff.
Did you have a plan
Oh, yeah.
formulated in your mind?
Well, I figured I was going to build that company up. I was going to develop that along with my insurance business. And so I went to work at it.
And is it about this time you become partnered with Merchants National Bank, as became More America?
Well, this is after, my partnership with the Merchants was after I had developed the Morris Plan into a broader based company. I took it from a little $1 million company up to about $20 million in a short period of time, made a lot of money, and then I started broadening the scope. I was the first one in the Midwest, in fact the second one in the country, to organize a small business investment company. Congress had passed a bill which I helped develop. I went to Congress on several occasions to testify, and when they had the bill ceremony, President Johnson was president at the time, I was invited to the White House to be there when they were signing the bill. Well, I hesitated because I didn't care much for President Johnson, but since I'd never been invited to the White House before, and I haven't been since, I decided I ought to go. And I went there and I watched as he signed the bill, and then he gave me a pen and had a picture taken of me with him signing the bill. So it was quite a nice occasion in the White House. And I'm glad I went.
So now you started forming a lot of branches.
Then I organized, as I say, I was probably the first or the second or third company to organize a small business investment company in the country. And I formed this company, and when Coquelette heard about it, he called and he said, "Pete, we like what you're doing. Could we be part of it?" I said, "Sure you can." Well, so they wanted to be 50% owner of the small business investment company. So we each put in $500,000 and started this company where we're investing in new companies starting up. And they needed financial help and knowledge and stuff like that. After 2 years, Coke called, and we'd grown rapidly. We'd done well, made money. After 2 years, Coke called me back again. He said, "Pete," he said, "we'd like to sell you back our stock, just for what we paid for it, even though it's worth more money. We're a bank, commercial bank. We don't understand making those kind of loans to a startup company that, there's lots of risk involved. We don't know what risk is." So he said, "If you don't mind." I said, "Oh, it's fair enough." So we bought back that stock. And then it was 100% owned by More America.
Then you got into auto leasing?
Then we started a leasing company because there was a need for it. We were financing a bunch of leases. So we decided to form one of our own. Well, we started out by owning a Ford dealership in Mount Vernon, and then expanded from there and started leasing cars to people to buy them. And then as those cars came back, we had to start a used car dealership. So we bought out Ollie Schwab in Cedar Rapids, way out on First Avenue, and he stayed with us, and we sold our lease cars through his dealership. And that worked out pretty good for several years. And the man in charge of the whole deal was a fellow by the name of Emmett Sherman. Emmett Sherman had come here from Dyersville, Iowa. He was with Allen Motor Company before coming with me. He headed up that division and did an outstanding job. He built it up to where we were doing $50 million worth of business a year. Unfortunately, we couldn't afford it anymore because the banks would only loan us on a 10-to-1 ratio. We had to have $5 million of our money in the deal to borrow $50 million so we could do that much business. Well, I didn't want to put any more money in it, and life investors at that time wanted it pretty badly. They wanted to get into the leasing business, and they had nothing but money. So they bought it and paid me a nice premium and took Emmett Sherman with it, and they built it from $50 million to $500 million in just a few years because they had nothing but money to invest coming in from policyholders, and they could do that, and they did a tremendous job.
Was that Lease America that you
Lease
sold
America,
to life investors?
That's right. That's right. That was a wholly owned subsidiary of the More America.
And then you tried the banking business.
Yes, and I had an opportunity to buy a bank in Maquoketa, Iowa. The elderly person was wanting to sell it, and I heard about it, so I went over and visited with him and was able to buy it on reasonable terms. And it was about a $25 million bank. I had it for about 10 years and built up to $75 million, and then sold it to the Hawkeye Security Insurance Company.
Wheatland, didn't you?
And then I had a chance to buy the. We'd always wanted a branch of the bank in Maquoketa in Wheatland, since it wasn't very far away. And I had been trying to buy the Wheatland Bank, but they wouldn't sell. And finally, I got word that they were willing to sell. People in Davenport owned it, so I approached them, and sure enough, they were willing to sell. So I bought the Wheatland Bank.
Why did you want to buy a small bank in Wheatland?
Well, it was only about $5 million in size, and I thought, well, I can do better than that, even in a small town. Well, when I finally sold it, it was doing $25 million worth of business. So believe me, there are opportunities there.
How did you grow the business then?
Oh, just by promotion and doing a lot of action in the community, helping in the community, participating in everything that went on, and hiring the right manager to do the job.
You were telling me that there was no place for the farmers to park, so you...
Oh, well, that was in Maquoketa. Maquoketa was fenced in. The main street of town, the one block, had merchants on each side of the block, but people, farmers and others, came in town, they had no place to park. So I'd been down in Missouri one time and visited a friend of mine that their town had just bought everything on the back, the street behind the main street, and torn down, made a big parking lot out of it. So I thought, well, why can't I do that in Maquoketa? And I approached the other merchants, and they said, sounds pretty good. So we bought all the buildings on the back behind the bank, and first thing you know, our back door was our front door, because people could park all that way and for free. And I did that on both sides, and it was just fantastically successful. And it was darn good for our bank. As I said, I took that bank from $25 million to $75 million in a town like Maquoketa. That was pretty good.
Any banks in Cedar Rapids?
Yes, and I had a chance to buy the City National Bank in Cedar Rapids from Ernie Burrish. Ernie's from Anamosa. Ernie he had a number of small town banks. He knew how to run a small town bank, but he had a little difficulty with a large town bank, because Ernie could make a decision on every loan that was made. I mean, he had to have all that information in front of him. I relied on our manager to make those decisions. I didn't, what the hell. If he didn't make the right ones, he'd be fired after a while. So I bought it from Ernie, and that was doing about $25 million worth of business at the time. And when I sold it to the Hawkeye, it was doing $75 million worth of business. So we had pretty good growth in that bank.
So at this time in your life, you're talking about the Morris Plant Investment Company.
The More America Financial Corporation was the parent company of all of them.
Okay, and you're talking about auto leasing, Lease America.
And the venture capital company and the banks. They're all owned by the More America Financial Corporation.
Where was there more than Cedar Rapids as far as offices? Did you have them in any
We
other
had offices.
towns?
We had offices. I bought out the Morris Plant of Davenport, the first acquisition. Then I bought out the Morris Plant of Des Moines. And then we opened up in Waterloo, Dubuque, Sioux City.
What kind of assets are we talking about at this time?
Oh, the Morris Plant alone had probably assets of about $100 million by this time. That was from that little company that was $1 million, and I bought it originally. We were doing about $100 million. Pretty good sized company.
How many employees are we talking about?
Oh gosh, I would say a couple hundred by this time.
Did you ever have second thoughts about overexpansion, possibly?
Nah, I never gave that a thought. An optimist never thinks about the negative part. Always thinks about the positive. And I did, and everything went great until we got a president of the United States by the name of Jimmy Carter, who didn't know what economics were.
Yeah. At what age did you retire?
I retired at age 65. I'd I'd established a policy years before that any executive of the company had to retire at age 65. Mm-hmm. So when I got to be 65, I figured, well, if it was good for them, it was good for me too.
What year was this?
It was in 1980.
Who replaced you?
Jerry Maples, my son-in-law, who had been the president of our bank in Maquoketa.
Wasn't shortly after this that the prime lending rates went?
Well, this is one of the difficult things in business today. Jimmy Carter came in as president, and unfortunately, I don't think he understood what economics meant. And he let the prime rate get to 21.5%, and the inflation went to 15%. It broke 50% of the savings and loans in the country. 50%. It cost us taxpayers $50 billion to bail out those savings and loans. I had two savings and loans. More America and Morris Plan were savings and loans, but they weren't federally insured. So I had to bail them.
You were?
I were privately owned. And it was a different scheme than the corporations that were savings and loans at that time. So I had to bail out the depositors. And that took a lot of money, but we paid them all off finally.
When you borrowed money, you had to borrow at 20.5%?
By that time, it got up to 20.5%.
Then you'd turn it around and loan it out to people?
Well, at about 15 or 16, you can't make any money. You lose. Yeah. You can't lose it faster. And it hit me harder in my hotel that I'd built than anything else at the time.
Yeah. You had already retired. Did you give any thought, or were you asked to come back and to kind of help manage and bail them?
No, I didn't. I was chairman of the board, so I knew what the story was. I think if I had to do over, I'd do it differently. But that's, by this time had been retired for 5 years.
And so, bankruptcy.
That's right.
Only resort.
That's right.
Were there many other savings? I imagine there were
a
lot of other savings.
Well, 50% of them in the country. One other in Cedar Rapids, the old Bohemian Savings and Loan. They never did reopen. The government had to pay off everybody in there, and that cost them millions.
And this caused you to sell a lot of your assets to try to.
Oh yes, I had liquidated most things in order to pay off all the depositors, and they finally took about 5 years. They got their money back. They didn't get paid for the interest that they would have had, but they got their principal back, and that was more important than anything. Mm-hmm.
Is there anything of the business today remaining?
Yes. Well, let's see. Not of the direct business. They were all sold by this time. Like Lease America was sold to Life Investors, and since then they've sold it to somebody else. Yeah. And More America Capital Corporation, that's gone somewhere. I don't know. Mm-hmm. I haven't followed up on all that.
You were a true entrepreneur, probably before entrepreneurs were considered cool.
I think that's probably right.
And you made an awful big imprint on Cedar Rapids. What's some of the positions you held in the city and the community?
Well, as I say, I was president of the Junior Chamber of Commerce, and then I was on a lot of boards in the community. St. Luke's Hospital Board for a number of years, and Co-College Board of Directors. My wife was on the Cornell Board of Directors, so we were competitive in that regard.
Let's blow your horn a little bit. Tell us about some of your accomplishments in the 50s and 60s, when it all started, renovation and urban renewal.
Well, I started in actually, Don Canny, who was the mayor for quite a few years, and I were very good friends. And he had gotten into this urban renewal development and bought the whole block between 1st Street and 2nd Street on 1st Avenue. And it was cleaned off, all the buildings were taken down, and it was offered for sale. Well, he couldn't find a buyer anywhere. He tried, he did his best, but he couldn't find anybody to buy it. And after about 3 or 4 years, he called me and said, "Pete," he says, "we got a problem. Can you help me out?" I said, "Well, Don, I'll see what I can do." I did have a friend of mine in Minneapolis, a contractor, who had built several high-rise apartments in downtown, down in the lower end of Hennepin Avenue in downtown Minneapolis. So I flew up there and went through one of these, and I said, this is perfect. It'd be just ideal for part of that block. And I came back and contracted with this fellow from Minneapolis to come down and build a building like that for me. And so I told Kenny, I said, well, I got half the block taken care of. He said, well, what about the other half? I said, I'll see what I can do. So I called my friend Bill Brenton in Des Moines, who owned the Brenton Banks. I knew he had wanted to come to Cedar Rapids, and I'd gotten to know him quite well. I called him up and I said, Bill, I got just a location for you in Cedar Rapids if you want it. Told him where it was. He said, we'll take it. Didn't, right over the phone, he'll take it. So by golly, they came over and built their bank on half the block, and I built the Cedar River Towers on the other half the block. And we took care of a nice chunk of urban renewal and got the city out of a big problem there.
You were telling me that you had an apartment right up on the top floor.
I was accused of building a house 26 stories up in the air with 150 apartments below to pay for it. And they did.
Did you have a fireplace up there?
Yes. That was another interesting experience. Because it was on the top floor, I could have a fireplace. Go right through the ceiling, and you're out in the open air. And one day we had a fire in the fireplace. And the first thing you know, I heard all fire trucks coming all around the place. I wonder what's going on here. Well, when a fire occurs in a high-rise apartment or in a hotel or anything, the elevators stop. So I had to walk down 26 stories to the first floor where the firemen were all congregated. And I said, what's up? He said, well, we smell some wood smoke. We can't find it. I thought, uh-oh. I said, fellas, I think I know where it is. And so they got the elevator started, and we went up 26 stories. And sure enough, I had a fire in my fireplace, and the draft, instead of drafting the way it should, went under the door and set off fire alarm. That's the only time that ever happened, but it did happen that time, and they
Embarrassed?
Yeah, a little embarrassing, but at least we solved a problem.
And you told me you renovated the American building.
Oh yes, well, we'd been in this property right across the street from the American building, across from the Roosevelt Hotel and the American building. That's where our first remodeling project. We went from the ORC building up to that corner, and took this old hotel building that was over there, and made a real nice office. That was our first move. And then when the urban renewal came along, they bought that building and couldn't tear it down. So I went across the street and bought the American building from Shmulikoff and a couple other people that owned it, and then completely remodeled it. Put central air conditioning in it, new elevators, and outside renovation, and really made a wonderful building out of that building, that old building.
Yep. How about the Blair House? Were you involved in it?
Yes. Then a friend of mine from Des Moines, who was the owner of one of the hotels in downtown Des Moines, and also the owner of the apartment project out on 2nd Avenue. What's the name of that apartment project on about 12th Street? The big apartment on 2nd Avenue. I forget.
Avery?
No.
No.
On 2nd Avenue, I'm on 12th Street. Anyhow, he owned that. He wanted to build a new building here, but he needed a partner, a local partner in particular. So he came to visit me, and I said, sure, I'll go in with you. So I helped out. I only owned a minority interest in the thing, maybe 25%, and he owned the rest. And we built the Blair House. And it was successful from the start, filled up rapidly. And then we later converted it to condominium and got rid of it that way.
What was the address of the Blair House?
2222 First Avenue, southeast.
And you were also instrumental in saving the Paramount Theater.
Well, yes, that was an interesting story. The Paramount had been a run-down theater for many years, but a beautiful old theater. They used to run second-run pictures and stuff like that. not steady, but regular, but occasionally. And the downtown merchants about that time were trying their best to keep Montgomery Ward downtown. Montgomery Ward was on 2nd Street between 2nd Avenue and 3rd Avenue. And so the merchants decided, well, maybe they'll stay downtown if we give them a parking area. And the parking area would be where Paramount Theater was. Well, it hadn't worked in Des Moines. They did the same thing. Montgomery Ward moved out anyhow. So I thought, well, why tear down a beautiful old theater like the Paramount Theater? So I called the people in Lincoln, Nebraska that owned it and made an offer, and they sold it to me. And I immediately gave it to the Symphony. But the mayor called me and he said, don't give it to the Symphony, give it to the city, and we'll let Symphony have the first right of refusal on it, on the use of it. Because we can maintain it. We got the hotel motel tax and we can do that. So that's what the route I followed. Well, the merchants met that following day, all set to decide. And here was the leaders of the downtown merchants. Al Shmulikoff, Herb Killian, Bob Armstrong, Nick Kramer, a couple other guys. And I was invited to the meeting. Well, when they opened the meeting, I said, wait a minute, don't waste any more time. I hate to tell you this, but I already bought the theater, and I gave it to Symphony. I didn't know whether they were going to hang me or what, but they all cheered. They all cheered. They really didn't want to tear it down. They were so happy that it was taken care of. And by golly, it's been beautiful ever since.
Then you also helped the Boy Scouts out in...
Well, then the Boy Scouts had been renting location for years, different locations, never had enough room for their activities. I was active in scouting. My son was a scouter. And so I got well acquainted with a scout executive, and he said, you know, we got a place that we'd love to have our home, which would be out there on Collins Road. But he said, we can't afford that. I said, see what I can do. Well, I just happened to have a charitable foundation that I had established several years before, and I hadn't done anything with it. It had a pretty good chunk of money in it. So I called my friend Claire Rice, who was the head of Collins Radio at the time, and I said, Claire, the Boy Scouts want to build a home, and I'll build it for them. I'll pay for it if you'll give them the land right on the corner of your property. He said, we'll do it. He didn't hesitate a minute. So by golly, between Claire Rice's giving the land, I gave the building, we had a new home for the Boy Scouts. And that lasted them for 20-some years, from 1975 until a couple years ago. And all of a sudden a restaurant comes along and wants a doggone location. And we're willing to pay anything to get that location. You know, in a restaurant, it's a location, location, location. Anyway, well, we found a empty building over on the west side. It had been a small manufacturing company, which was twice the size of what the Boy Scouts saw it was. And they were asking $1.2 million for the darn thing, this place over on the west side. So I told the executive, I said, you get them to buy that and we'll trade even. Well, that was a pretty good deal. They did. And by golly, Boy Scouts moved. Well, then, of course, the Boy Scouts needed money to move, so I gave them $25,000 so they could move over there. But now we got a place that is tremendously big and lots of parking. It's just ideal.
And your place out there at Rockwell, they named it the Bezanson Service Center.
Bezanson Service Center, that's right.
Would that have been the Biagis, the former restaurant owners that...
No, Biagis are the ones that bought it, see. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You were very instrumental in renovating the Roosevelt.
Yes, that is another disaster area that I got into through the back door. Sud Cook owned the Roosevelt Hotel, and I had for years and years, maybe he built it, I don't know. But anyhow, the employees wanted to unionize, and Sud said, nothing doing. If you unionize, I'm closing the place. They didn't believe him. They unionized. The following weekend, he locked the door. He says, sorry, fellas, you're no longer employed. And all of a sudden we have a vacant building downtown, a vacant hotel, the only hotel downtown. By this time, Montrose had gone out of business. And the mayor, Don Canny, my quote friend, called me up and said, Pete, geez, we got to do something about it. We got to have a hotel. Can you help us out? I said, well, I'll do what I can. So I called a friend of mine down in Phoenix, Arizona. He owned a whole bunch of motels throughout the West that we had financed. Through our leasing company, we'd financed all of his equipment in all these places all over the country. Got to know him quite well, and I told him the problem. He says, I'll fly up and bring a crew with me. So he flew up in his own company plane and brought a potential manager, a contractor, and an advance man with him. And they spent the weekend in the hotel. And the advance manager went around to all the motels in Cedar Rapids area and said, if you have an overflow, would you send them down if we open that hotel again? They said, we sure will. When we opened up 2 weeks later, we were full from the overflow that people coming to Cedar Rapids. And we're quite successful from then on. Well, the contractor, of course, did a lot of remodeling in there and did a heck of a nice job.
Then you were involved with the Five Seasons?
Well, about that time, Don Canny, as I said, my friend, and he was a very good friend, but he kept calling on me all the time for these darn things. He called me up, he said, well, you know, you've just taken care of this one urban renewal block on 1st Street and 1st Avenue. Now we got one on 3rd Street to the tracks, and he said, we've been trying to sell that now for several years. We can't do anything about it. Can you help me out? So I went to work on that. Well, I had a friend that was in the architectural business for that type of construction. I invited him over and we sat down talking about what could be done there. He said, well, here's the deal that somebody had done over in Ohio somewhere. They had built an arena with a hotel on top of it. Well, I knew Cedar Rapids had wanted an arena for years and been turning it down, and every time it came up for a vote, turn it down. So I thought, well, now we can solve that problem. If we build the arena and it won't cost taxpayers any money, they ought to vote it in. So we went to the public and they voted in by 80%, the highest any bond issue had been offered. The 20% will be against anything. I don't care. Second coming of Christ, they'd be against it. But anyhow,
I agree with you.
The nice part of that was that building a hotel on top of it, the taxes from the hotel would pay off the bond issue. $7 million bond issue for the arena, Five Seasons Center. And I'd build a $10 million hotel on top of it, and the taxes from that pay that off. And then some person said, well, yeah, but it's going to cost us money to run the thing. I said, no, it won't, because the hotel motel tax from the hotel will pay all the expenses of not only that, but the expenses of the Paramount Theater as well. And they did, and have ever since. So, you know, the againers are going to be again anything.
Yep.
And they sure were.
Yep. Was this known as Stouffer's?
Well, the first management firm was Stouffer's. They're a hotel company that operated this type of hotel all around the country. In fact, it's interesting you asked about that because George Sell was the first manager. And he was an awfully nice fella. In fact, he called me this morning, today, to wish me a happy birthday. My birthday was on the 2nd of April. So, and every year he calls me. He's only about 2 years younger than I am, but he's very successful in his own right. But he was our first manager of the hotel and did an outstanding job. If he were still here, he'd still have it. But unfortunately, the hotel got into the same bind on this economic deal in the 80s that Jimmy Carter created, because when I built it, the only financing I could get was from the Aetna Insurance Company at 8%, which wasn't bad, but a floating rate loan, which I didn't pay any attention to. I thought, well, that never affect me. It was fine when the rate was 8%. The first year we did $1,200,000 of the business, so I had a $10 million loan, cost $800,000 for interest, and another $400,000 paid down the loan. First 2 years that way, it's great. It's going to be successful, great deal. Then the inflation came in, and the darn prime rate went to 21%. Instead of $800,000, it's cost me $2,100,000. I still only getting $1.2 million. Cost me $1 million a year. For 2 years, I said, Aetna, take it back. I don't want it anymore. I can't afford it. They're the only ones making any money on the darn thing. So I let it go. And unfortunately, because it was a darn good hotel. If I could have had a fixed rate at 8%, I'd still own the darn thing and still be doing well. But
Were you involved with the YMCA?
Well, on the reconstruction, as I mentioned earlier, when I
Pre-interview?
when I got to Howard Hall, and he took a fourth of it. Did I tell you the story?
Yes.
I think I mentioned it earlier in our discussion now. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. What year did your wife Lorraine pass away?
1999.
Mm-hmm. How old was she?
She was about 83.
Mm-hmm. Was she active in the community?
Oh yeah, she was on the board of the Cornell College, and she was active in various clubs here in town. She was a wonderful lady.
I think you were telling me that she was very active with the Cedar Rapids Symphony too.
Yes, she was active on the symphony board, and that was one of the reasons why we gave the theater to the symphony. I won't tell that story.
What's your children doing today, and where they live in, Peter?
Well, my daughter Judy is living in Cedar Rapids. She's married to an outstanding young man by the name of John Ruth, R-U-T-H. And he's an independent businessman, has his own company, consulting firm. He came to Cedar Rapids from Des Moines, and his background goes way back to where he was graduated from West Point, and then was international sales manager for John Deere and all that. And he came to Iowa as the president of Massey Ferguson Company. And when the farm debacle took place in the middle 70s, they sold the company, or disposed of the company. So then he came to Cedar Rapids, and first he was with McLeod first, and then he went to the Amanas and managed the Amana Society for a number of years, and did a tremendous turnaround down there in their business activity. Mm-hmm. And then after he left there, he came to Cedar Rapids. He lived in Cedar Rapids, but he formed his own company, the John Ruth and Associates. They're a consulting firm, and he consults with more darn companies and does awfully well. Then my son graduated from the University of Iowa Law School, head of his class. And because he was quite outstanding, they asked him, or he applied for and got a job as a clerk in the United States Supreme Court under Justice Blackmun. Was there for about a year. And then Sandy Boyd, who was the president of the University of Iowa, had him come back to Iowa as his assistant. So he was the vice president of the university in charge of the finances and so forth. And he was with Sandy until Sandy retired. And then the law school wanted him to come over and teach. So he decided, well, I don't know whether I'm ready for that yet. So he went out to Virginia to Washington Lee University as a dean of the law school out there. And was there for 7 years. And that was a wonderful experience and a tremendous place to be. At the end of 7 years, Iowa Law School had given him a 7-year leave of absence if he'd come back. They called him and said, your time is up. Are you coming back? He said, you bet. So he left the deanship and came back to the University of Iowa and has taught in the law school Supreme Court practices and constitutional law, and has been an outstanding professor down there ever since. Mm-hmm. He's getting close to retirement now too, I hate to admit it.
How many grandchildren did you end up with?
Well, I wound up with 3 grandchildren with my daughter and 2 with my son. 5 grandchildren.
Any great-grandchildren?
Oh, yes. Oh, gosh, I got lots of them. Mm-hmm. I got, 2, 3, 5, 6, 7 great-grandchildren through my daughter, and my son, not yet, but they're in the hopper.
Peter, as you said, what a life.
Been what a life.
Unless you have any other memories to share with us, the Cedar Rapids History Center, the Linn County Historical Society would like to thank you very much for sharing your memories with us.
I'm so happy to do it because it brings out a lot of these things that I had forgotten over the years, you know, you don't put them together.